Just to say thank you very much for everybody to coming along and joining and being part of the session. My name's Adam Tyler. I'm a Learning and Improvement Manager based in the Practice Excellence team. I'm really excited about delivering this here to you guys today because I'm delivering alongside some very special guests alongside me. So I've just want to introduce you a couple of people that are co-delivering with us today. So we've got Joe.
Hi.
So Joe's Service Manager for First Response. Then we've also got Georgina on the call.
Hiya.
Lovely. And we've got Georgina from the police. So today we're hoping, we've also got a couple of videos from a couple of workers across the local authority. We've got Charlotte Frost, who's going to give an insight from a manager's perspective, and then Kuda Boscher, who's the current social worker for the young person we're going to talk about today. And so just to kind of start off really, the session that we're going to run today is around a real young person and a learning review that has happened from a real case within Leicestershire County Council, and we're going to try and refer to him throughout today as JB. I am also very minded that everybody on this call, or the people that are delivering today, know this young person by his first name, and it's very difficult to kind of maintain this young person's confidentiality. But for the purpose of the session, we're going to call him JB. So just to really start off to say thank you to practitioners for being part of this and to share their practice and learning and what has happened. You're going to hear the story about JB and what had happened within the local authority about JB. This is a young man who was subject to a serious incident that had occurred, or I suppose technically a number of incidents that we were concerned about. This was a young man that survived and is still an open child to the local authority. So like I've said already, we're really going to try and be mindful of his confidentiality and not disclosing his name. But any details or any awareness of this young person that you do have, please be mindful that he has a right and you know, to have his confidentiality kept. So he is a young person, he's open to the local authorities, just be mindful of that. The information that you're going to hear today may be quite harrowing, may be quite upsetting, may be quite difficult for people to hear. So I'm just going to remind people at this part and then also at the end of the session today, to come and talk to us afterwards if you've got any questions or if there's anything that really kind of hits trigger, speaking to your managers and looking after yourself as a result of that, because some of the information we share will be, really difficult to hear. And the incident in relation to JB was information that was shared and is part of a formal learning review which went to the national panel to consider whether a child practice safeguarding review, which was formerly a serious case review, should take place. And although this didn't meet the threshold for a child practice safeguarding review, there's still a lot of learning, I suppose, from us individually as a local authority, as well as the police and agencies involved that have taken away from that. So part of the session today is about sharing that information and being aware of that. Very briefly, I've touched on a lot of this already, but you're going to hear and have an experience to hear from people who were working with JB at the time, including the social care and police. You're going to understand the learning from the session and what we learned as a local authority and what has changed in practice as a result of it, so it doesn't happen again. And then you're going to hear from practitioners who are involved and then see how this has influenced practice across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So I'm going to very briefly take you through a bit of background before you start to hear from other people, just so we can set the scene, so people are aware who JB is and what we knew about him at the time. So JB was a young boy that was at primary school. He was in the juniors at the time of our involvement. He lived with his birth father following a conclusion of care proceedings in another local authority. He was actually known to two other local authorities in the local area prior to coming to live in Leicestershire with his dad. JB had no contact with his maternal family, so he initially lived with his maternal family, but as a result of care proceedings moved to live with his dad. And that was, I think, in 2020, so around 2 years ago now. JB's father was in a relationship with someone across the road. So this was a lady across the road that he was also in contact with. And the concerns that we're going to discuss today happened coming on to a year ago, so 10 months ago, in September and October of last year. So we're going to take you very briefly through some of the referrals and the information that we received to carry on giving you some extra context to this. I'm going to try and keep this fairly brief. So in 2019, initially JB moved to Leicestershire following proceedings in the neighbouring local authority. Leicestershire were made aware that the proceedings were ongoing and were advised to contact social care at the end of proceedings. We were not informed about the end of proceedings or the fact that the neighbouring local authority wanted support from our service or from the local authority, and no information was received at the time of JB being placed with his dad. We didn't hear anything for a period of time until early 2021. So this was the beginning of last year. The next contact was a notification from the police after they responded to an anonymous call reporting that they'd seen somebody anonymously had seen JB eating rubbish out of the bins of a block of flats. Contact with school identified that they were aware of JB's vulnerabilities and were supporting Dad, who was taking on advice. At the time, JB was described as a child who was emotional and needy, and based on the information shared, the school agreed to undertake planned visits and re-refer if any concerns were raised. At that point, no significant safeguarding concerns were raised and no kind of request for further work was received. Again, another long period of time, this time didn't hear anything for approximately 9 months, and this brings us to early September last year. And there was a request made through from School for Early Help Services for JB. And the concerns were that his behaviour at home and over the last 12 months, these had become unmanageable. And this at this point included him soiling and wetting himself, stealing food. And when discussed with Dad, his narrative throughout this was relation to undiagnosed Crohn's disease. So what you're going to hear is during the conversations today is that this young boy's health was largely due to Crohn's disease, was what Dad was reporting. Dad himself has Crohn's, and it was just undiagnosed by the GP and by health at this stage. At this stage, the school were requesting counselling and behaviour support through from Early Help, and despite efforts from Children and Family Wellbeing Service, Dad did not engage or consent to this work, and Dad was difficult to get hold of. Fast forward to around 3 or 4 weeks later, when October 2021, school continued to report concerns, however, this time of neglect, expressing concerns for his health and behaviour needs. They had noted that he'd lost more weight and he was shivering and cold in class. At the time, they were noting that JB was there and he was falling asleep in class and often presented, with very little energy. JB had presented a few days earlier with a cut on his nose and a black eye, where information was reported that he'd slipped in the shower. There were ongoing concerns about his diet, food intolerances, and being linked to Crohn's, and Dad reporting quite regularly to school that he was getting support through his health services. However, schools were really concerned about his general weight loss. And it was at this point that it was agreed that a full assessment would be completed by social care. Various attempts were made by the social worker to engage father in the assessment. Father would not give consent to visiting in the family home, and used kind of COVID-19 and not being vaccinated as one of the reasons. We have to remember a lot of the information and contact we received last year was during some COVID restrictions, and that may have influenced how information was used and or processed, I suppose. But just really to be mindful that obviously there was lockdown restrictions, etc., during parts of this involvement. So Dad refused JB to be seen alone, reporting concerns of his previous social care involvement and not wanting it any longer. At the time, school nurse was reporting that JB had been seen in July by the GP, who'd raised no significant concerns and highlighted diet issues with Dad, who also suffered with Crohn's. Now, so after a period of time, I think it was around 3 weeks of not being able to see JB, a strategy discussion was agreed and held, which had some really good multi-agency attendance. However, JB had now not been in school for 9 days, so nobody had laid eyes on JB for a period of time, and everybody in that meeting was significantly worried about his well-being. Section 47 was agreed, with the main focus on seeing JB and getting out to see him and making sure he was all right and speaking to him on the same day. And the Section 47 was completed, he was seen on the same day. But father did not allow JB to be seen alone. JB was seen in the back of a car with a very thick coat on, next to stepmom. Because of Dad's kind of historical opinions of social care, Dad refused to allow social care into the property, but allowed police into the property, and the police reported kind of no neglect concerns that there appeared to, and you'll hear a little bit more about what that looked like from Georgina shortly. Father and his partner were very confrontational with the workers who attended and very critical of involvement in the past. Father reported that JB was currently unwell, and that's why he'd not been at school, and police and social care advised him to get to the GP. I suppose this is where I think things become really difficult to hear, I think. So I'm just kind of giving you the warning before I read the next bit. But when JB was seen by the GP 2 days later, he was admitted to hospital immediately. It was reported immediate assessment with a paediatrician because he's underweight and is now on the bottom centile. And this had been a young man who had been in the middle centiles and had effectively flatlined. And that JB immediately went to hospital with father at that time. What was seen by health professionals is really upsetting. It was reported on examination, the child appears severely malnourished and unwell, was in a nappy, and we have to remember this was a young person in junior years of his primary school education. His feet were so blotched and red. He had shiny sores on his feet where his shoes did not fit. He appeared extremely wasted, which may explain his low body temperature, low heart rate, and poor circulation to his feet. The medical people examining JB had identified that JB's body effectively had started shutting down. JB was in hospital for a further 3 weeks during social care involvement. And quite positively, JB went on and did really well in hospital and flourished as a result of that. What subsequently happened is that, the local authority issued care proceedings and JB was placed in local authority foster care. So you'll hear a little bit more about that later on. So that's a bit of the background, bit of the context, so everybody's aware of kind of some of the details in relation to JB. I appreciate some of that's a bit difficult to hear and a bit difficult, but I think it's important that you understand some of the context to our involvement. So I'm just conscious, I'm just going to hand over to Georgina, who's going to give a bit of an understanding, or a bit of an overview really from a police's perspective of what they saw during that child protection investigation. So over to you, Georgina.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name's George and I work as a detective in the child abuse unit. And like Adam says, I've joined this input to give a perspective from the police point of view and specifically talk about some of the challenges that were faced by the officer and the worker on the day when they made the visit. So that's what I'm going to talk through with you. So this case first came to police attention from a direct referral from Charlotte, who we're going to hear from in a minute, who had in her assessment correctly identified the case as urgent. This resulted in a review by the police, and an urgent strategy discussion was agreed. So at the time, Leicester Police actually had very little information about the family. And during the strat, the information shared by social services and the other agencies involved was really important and helped the police form the decision making at the time. And it would have been taken into consideration by the attending officer and the social worker when they went out on the visit. So this, we know, is a case of neglect, and neglect is complex because it takes so many forms. That's why we need to be clear as professionals what we want to achieve during each visit that we make in order to make our assessment of what does or doesn't need to happen. Again, this is important. I mention this because we're going to be talking about challenging parents. So during the strat, a number of concerns were identified, and they've been beautifully described by Adam. Of note to the police were that JB presented with a black eye and a cut to his nose at school. He had severe weight loss, he was picking through bins, and he was stealing food from other children's lunchboxes. So a huge red flag. The school had also noticed that he was lethargic and he was shivering and appeared to be cold when others weren't, and Dad was refusing to engage other than to provide an explanation for the injuries. We know that JB was later absent for 9 days, so a substantial amount of time to be absent from school in one go. Now, I revisit some of the concerns mentioned by Adam because they should be the focus of our decision making during the visits. Some of these concerns, which have already been mentioned, first came to light in October 21, and when a referral was made by school. At this time, a strap was not held. This resulted in possible missed opportunities. Police never became involved directly, and there was never that opportunity to document any injuries, to view any injuries, and the possibility of a medical. It was, however, agreed sometime later, a few weeks later, that a Section 47 was now met, and the child was then determined to be at significant risk of harm. So after the discussion, police documented that one of two things were being considered. It was either abuse or a medical condition as the options, and we know this because of what Dad has offered as an explanation. So at this time, from our point of view, the objective of the Section 47 was to determine whether the child needed medical attention, whether that was due to a condition or whether that was due to abuse. It was also to check the address, do a physical check of the address, and establish if food was available. Also important. We would have considered arrest at this stage. However, this wouldn't be something that would be discussed in the strat, because it would be for the attending officer to make that assessment from the information that's available during the visit. So there were a number of challenges that the attending officer and worker faced when they arrived to do the visit, and I'm going to consider these now. So firstly, Dad was obstructive and initially refused access to the home. Now, this is problematic when we're dealing with neglect, because clearly that's something that we need to be establishing. So this resulted in JB being spoken to in the car. Dad was initially standing outside of the car, although he did later let officers into the home. So there may have been considerations around why the car was chosen to do the questioning, but they weren't documented. So we as professionals need to be rationalising our decisions. This is just an example of one decision, but we need to be rationalising our decisions about why we choose to do something, but also why we choose not to do something if we decide not to act. So the officer and the worker then did manage to speak to JB. However, leading questions were used and asked, and the questioning lacked relevant detail, which is hugely important because it would have made it difficult to make an accurate assessment of the child. Ideally, JB should have been spoken to in a neutral environment to allow him the best opportunity to talk openly and freely. And this is why we use schools so often, because they're such a good place to speak to children. They're neutral, they're safe, they're away from the family home and any risks that there are there, and they can't be influenced by the presence of a parent in the home at the same time. So I'm going to come back to where we speak to JB in a minute as well. As we know, the child was also dressed in a large coat, and this restricted his appearance significantly and made him difficult to access and assess. So this is challenging, particularly when considering neglect. Think of baby P, his face being covered in chocolate as an example. That hid marks, scars, injuries on his faces. The coat was particularly large, and we need to be considering, could that be hiding something? Can we see his body? Can we make an assessment? And the answer to that was no, we couldn't. It would have been that observing him, we would be unable to determine and assess or access his weight and his body. The concerns about his weight, about food, would need to be addressed properly in the Q&A with appropriate questioning, as well as checking the home and checking him to the best of the attending officer's ability. Now, clearly, none of us are medical experts, but again, we are rationalising decisions that we make to do something and not to do something, as I mentioned before. JB must be given the opportunity to provide a detailed account to us, to be clear, open questioning, and preferably a comfortable environment. So it may be that the only option that the officer and the social worker deemed available to them at the time was in the car. If that's the case, the child must also be seen. He must be checked, and the level of check will be down to those attending, to that officer and that worker. It will be down to their discretion to decide what's best. We know he was wearing a large cloak. Clearly, no proper assessment of the child can be made whilst he's in the coat, and we should seek to have it removed, ask him to remove it. Where this is done, again, is a matter for those that are present with him. In this particular instance, the officer lacked experience from no fault of his own, but this did contribute and influence the decision making that day. So the purpose of the Section 47 is joint working, and therefore attempts should be made by both agencies. So on this note, it's important perhaps to mention that often the attending police officer isn't present in the strat, because it's normally held by a sergeant and not by a DC, a detective that would go out. So therefore, it's really, really important that the social worker, who has knowledge of the family and may have knowledge of being present on the strat, that if there was anything that needed to be raised at the location, does that before the child is left, if we're going to leave the child there. So we also know that JB hadn't been present at school for 9 days. So the option of speaking to him in school wasn't available in this case. Challenge number 3. So when this is the case, we need to be extra vigilant about how and where we speak to the child to satisfy ourselves that the child's welfare can be assessed thoroughly. When Dad eventually did allow us access to the home, it was deemed of a satisfactory condition by the officer. But again, it's important to note that sometimes when dealing with neglect, much emphasis is placed on conditions of the home. But if we consider another case, if we consider a Victoria Columbier, again, a middle-class family, immaculate home, it can distract from other factors that must be considered when we're there. And that goes back to the child and how we question him. We know that there were challenges in locating the child due to Dad and partner being obstructive. Therefore, what do we do if they refuse us access to the child? If they refuse us refuse to allow us to speak to him, what do we then do? So we've determined that we need to see the child and hear his voice. We've determined that we need to access the home. So when dealing with challenging parents, the message is clear that we must make all attempts to do the things that we would normally do in any other situation. So we must ultimately speak to the parents, explain to them what we need to do or what we want to do and why, if need be. We need to ensure that everything has been done by us to appeal to them, to build a rapport, to develop a relationship, so that whatever action needs to be done can take place as smoothly as possible, basically with their cooperation. We can speak calmly and use phrases like, we'd like to speak to JB and we need to do this alone. Of course, this may be met with refusal, and on this case, it did. So we can then explain to Dad the reason that we need to speak to JB is to ensure that he's safe, which is the truth. Now, the police, I guess, like the word safe because it's specifically chosen. And that's because most parents want their child to be safe and they want others to perceive that, or want us to perceive that their child is safe in their care. However, if we're dealing with parents who have something, if you like, to hide, they should also be able to recognise that as authorities, we need to make sure that our child is safe. So if all reasonable efforts have been made to speak to the child, to gain access to the house, and if they've been exhausted and refused, then we need to consider what our options are. What are our powers? What do we have available to us? Can we agree a Section 20? Would he be open to that? If not, can we arrest? Do we suspect an offence has happened? And again, that will be a matter for the police officer. If the answer is yes, then that is certainly available to us to do. Is a Section 46 appropriate in these circumstances? I would argue, yes, it is. And the other thing that would be more relevant to you is, could we have considered some sort of order before we attend? So there's our options. Ultimately, if we're met with refusal and cooperation, then all this is going to do is escalate our concerns, and our concerns about the parents as well. So in the case of JB, it's more of a concern to us that Dad's obstructive, and this should have heightened our risk assessment. So we were unable to affect our objective of speaking to JB in a suitable environment with suitable clothing, which again is completely relevant in allowing us to make our risk assessment. So the coat was an issue for us. Again, can we speak to Dad? Can we appeal to him? Would he even agree to speak to somebody else? You know, if not, then we've got to consider what we can do. So I'm going to sum up, because I'm falling into sort of repeating myself a bit, but obviously looking back, it's easy for us to be able to consider what we could have done differently. But when dealing with challenging behaviour, it's important that we always remain professional. We ensure that we know our objectives and that they are met or attempted to be met and exhausted as best as we can. If they can't, then we need to utilise our backup. We need to consider what our backup is, our contingencies. And in this case, I think that there was a number of small errors made on that day, which led to bigger sort of consequences. And so things could certainly have been done differently, and a small thing amounted to a big thing in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for that. And I think the point, just to pick on, really, it's easy to kind of sit back now, looking back 10, 11 months ago and thinking what we could have done differently and what we could have done at the time. And I suppose that's where the learning comes from, doesn't it? Is some of those conversations of thinking what we could do differently. How do we kind of avoid that happening again? So I think a really helpful insight from, I suppose, particularly a police's perspective in that work as well. So thank you, George. I know you've got to dash off, so please don't let us hold you for any longer than you need to be here, but thank you for joining us today. Next up, we're going to hear from Charlotte. So Charlotte's the first response team manager that was involved in the case, and we're going to hear a bit of a background, and it's going to talk before I finish talking. Hold on. Thank you very much for joining us today, Charlotte. It's really appreciated. It's really helpful from our perspective to have the views and details of the practitioners that are involved, the managers, and what you were hearing and seeing whilst working with JB. So I think it's really important that we hear your views and your opinions of what it was like on the ground in working with him. So I'd like to kind of get straight in there, really. From your point of view then, so what were the positives that you felt as a team and as individuals in working with JB?
I have to give some credit to the social worker, because, you know, he was quite pushy with getting into the property. He didn't just stop. He would go out and do pop-out visits. He'd be phoning Dad. He was trying to think outside the box of trying to get in contact with Dad. He brought him a phone, except Dad never put a SIM card in it, so we couldn't get in contact with him. He'd do pop-out visits. He tried to arrange to see him at school. He said, I'll come to your workplace, I'll come to where you keep your horses, I'll come to your property. And at every point, Dad would put up a barrier that he couldn't do that. Obviously we were in COVID times, someone had COVID, he was at work, he couldn't get the time off, he'd get the sack. So there were lots and lots of barriers, and he wanted to be there when we saw. He was quite clear on that. We asked if we could see him with his partner, but he wouldn't allow us to do that. So there was some really good work there from the social worker. And I think although it took us a month to get in to see, it was only 1 month. As much as that sounds like a long time, you know, we really tried. And I think it got to the point where we said, if we can't get in now, we'll do a strategy discussion and we'll try and do it jointly with the police. And I think that's what we did. And one of the other positives, I think, was working with the police. The DS in charge was very much, she would message me, we'd talk about the case, and you'd see kind of her thinking on the case. She was very worried about it, and I think we were very worried when we got to that point about what was happening with this child. We had lots of dad's voice saying it was health issues, school had got health issues, and I think the joint working with school, with police, with ourselves was very good. It was very joined up, and we had a lot of history from school as well, which was great.
I think that's one of the things I noticed when you're working with JB was, you know, that real good kind of information sharing from school, kind of having the right people there at that strategy discussion when the strat happened. I thought it was some really kind of good positive pieces of work of gathering information and using that as part of the assessment. When JB kind of came into care then, one of the real positives that I pulled out was about some of the practice that happened whilst, you know, he was still in hospital and whilst you were kind of in that kind of middle period waiting for an application to court. Do you want to explain a little bit about kind of some of the really good work that we saw there?
Yeah, so we got Kathy, our family intervention worker, involved, and she was going in on a daily basis to see JB. Basically because we felt he had no one. His dad wasn't going into the hospital. He had no contact with his mum. We sorted out contact with his I think he's a great grandfather, to go in and see him. But Kathy really took on, kind of say, a mothering role. She made sure he had presents for his birthday, made sure he had things to do. We all collected stuff in the office and sent it in for him, and she took it in. And I mean, to be fair to him, he'll go, no, I don't want that, or I do want that. But he had someone to be there for him, and I think Kathy and him got on really, really well. And Kathy would come back and say, oh, Charlotte, I need such and such. I'm like, yep, no problem, go out and get it for him. We've got section 17. So that bit of work, I think, made him feel more comfortable with social workers, full stop, because he saw Kathy as part of that process and allowed him to build a bond with someone and made him more at ease with us. So that kind of transition into care, local authority care, was really good, because I think Kathy went and explained it to him with the social worker, and they tried to make the process as easy as possible for him, because he suffered so much trauma, not just with his dad, but in his early life as well. He, you know, from his mum to his grandmother to his dad, you know, so much trauma, and that we needed to make that a bit better for him, really. Nothing was going to make it better, but a bit better and more palatable, I think, would be the thing.
One of the things that really stood out was his birthday at hospital as well, and buying him a birthday cake and presents and things like that. I thought that was really lovely from going back and reading it. So just want to kind of take you then over to think about things that maybe that you could have done differently, or if you had your time again, what you would have kind of focused on and looked at. It's very easy to look, isn't it, afterwards, after the event, to kind of reflect back. And I suppose that's what I want you to kind of have a think about. You know, is there anything that you felt as a team that you could have done differently?
And I think, like you said, reflection is really good for us, looking at what we could have done differently and perhaps picking up on some of the things that we would change in the future. One of the things for me as a manager was, when I was doing the strategy discussion, I should have looked at and thought about the neglect medical, and having got that done. I mean, it was just mentioned on the strategy discussion that I missed. On reflection, it wouldn't have made any difference, because Dad wasn't allowing us to see him and wouldn't have given us consent. And actually, the way it happened, he had that medical when he got to hospital, but we should have thought about that on the strategy discussion. That should have been part of the thought process, and it was very much missed. With regards to doing things differently from manager to social work, I think I would have liked to have gone out and done a joint visit with Frank, and we perhaps could have got in there quicker if we'd been daily pushing it, but because of the kind of story that Dad was telling us and the information that we'd got initially, it wasn't as concerning, but as time went on, it got more and more concerning. And I think that's where we kind of, over the weeks, we saw a change in the information we were receiving. So, but I think a joint visit, and perhaps we could have been pushier on that home visit to have seen JB in the car.
Yeah.
We needed to see him. He had his coat on, his hood up. Perhaps we should have been a little bit more pushy on that front. And we could have used our powers at that point to, you know, perhaps police could have used their powers at that point to have removed him had we seen him in the state that we saw him in only a few days later.
And it's really difficult, isn't it? In the context of having a dad who is kind of reluctant to engage, not allowing you to see him, not allowing to have those conversations, that, you know, kind of was quite clearly his narrative throughout was, you know, JB's issue were medical issues. You know, it's very easy to see how that narrative that dad has portrayed to all professionals, you know, can be taken. So I think there's some really interesting points that you raise, and you know, some really kind of helpful, reflective kind of thoughts that you've kind of raised from your experience of that.
One of the other things that we didn't have at the time of receiving the referral was the full information from the previous local authority. So we perhaps, I mean, in hindsight and reflecting on this case, it was a case that perhaps should have had 2 workers on it, because we could have done with one doing kind of some of the chasing about and one going out and do the visits. But that information from the other local authority would have been really, really helpful. And there was, when the initial information came through to us, he'd been known, JB had been known to us previously because we'd had some information given to us from the other local authority that was coming into his dad's care, but at that point we didn't get all the full and comprehensive information, and we perhaps should have done at that point, but we definitely should have chased it a bit quicker, or kept chasing it, being more dogmatic, I think the word is, about it.
I'm just going to pause it at that point, because there's a number of points that Charlotte's going to make that Joe is going to make in a minute. So I just think it's most probably helpful to kind of pause it at that point. Just to really say, I think it's so brave being able to kind of being exposed and talk about your practice, and kind of being able to share the things that you're learning, the things your reflections. So I really appreciate Charlotte for recording that for us. You may have noticed some gremlins going on in my screen. I have my old computer crashed and all sorts, but hopefully the show will go on. So I'm just going to move on the next slide to Joe. And move over to Joe to kind of talk about some of the learning really that we've looked at as a result of it. So over to you then, Joe.
Thank you. I think that we've probably covered some of what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to try and speak about the main things really that we need to think about. And I come from a perspective of gathering that information at those initial stages. Charlotte's talked about what happens once the case progressed to our assessment team, but I'm coming from an angle of the initial stages of making inquiries in relation to JB. It's nothing really that we don't already know. I mean, you only have to look at the learning from serious case reviews, and some of this learning in relation to JB around understanding history and the relevance of history, the professional curiosity. You know, quite often it's there in the serious case reviews. So I'm not really going to be telling you anything that you don't already know. But what we do know sometimes is, especially when we are quality assuring work, is that we don't always consider history consistently across children's files, or are professionally curious. And I think this highlights really, you know, particularly in JB's case, the relevance of understanding history and being trauma informed, because as Charlotte said in her video, you know, JB was known to to other local authorities. And I think when we started to make enquiries with JB, we presumed that because he'd been known to other local authorities and he had had a supervision, he was subject to a supervision order with his father, that actually assessments had been done and things must have been okay for him to be placed with his father. But actually, what had in fact happened was that although he was subject to a supervision order with his father, he didn't go and live with his father until there was 4 months left of that supervision order. And Charlotte quite rightly says that, you know, we probably missed our opportunity. We know how challenging sometimes it can be to get information from other local authorities, but in this case, the first contact that we had, it was actually made by the other local authority. We could have seized that opportunity and got the information that we needed, because in actual fact, JB had quite a traumatic history. When he had moved to Leicestershire, he hadn't really formed any relationship with either birth parents. He had been exposed to domestic abuse, neglect and cannabis use with his mum, and he was made subject to a child arrangements order with his grandmother. And then unfortunately went on to be exposed to further drug use, alcohol use and neglect. So we didn't know all of that when we started to make inquiries on JB, and maybe that would have altered our decision making at the time. Moving on to professional curiosity, I think we've already said about challenging the narrative and having different hypotheses when we are making inquiries about children. We probably tended to go along with Dad's narrative of possible Crohn's, and we perhaps didn't triangulate that information as much as what we could have done with agency checks, and really JB being the heart of those inquiries, so that we can really understand his lived experiences, knowing about who's in the genogram and the network and what relevance that is to JB. We didn't really understand the sort of the significance of Dad's partner. As it's already been mentioned, Dad kept people at arm's length. He got his partner to liaise with professionals, establishing fact from opinion, and just picking apart all of that information, and making agency checks to make sure that we make the right decision. We did have our first anonymous contact well before we reviewed our structure in first response. And if we did have an anonymous contact now, we would most likely deal with this case very differently. And like Adam said, this case, a lot of the inquiries were done whilst we were in lockdown or during COVID. So JB wasn't at school, he was home learning. And when we did have an anonymous contact, we made those checks with the school. We left it with them to go and make a visit to see JB. But actually now we have changed the way that we respond to anonymous information and neglect. We since February this year, we no longer take anonymous referrals online. Quite often when we used to have anonymous referrals online, we'd probably get a sentence or at best a paragraph about the concerns of that child. It would be very generalised, and it'd be very hard for us we'd be going from very limited information, and we want to make decisions. We want to make a threshold decision, aim to do that within 24 hours. And we were finding that we were chasing a lot of the information when we were taking referrals in that way. So from February this year, we do take all anonymous referrals over the phone now. and that has seen much better quality information gathering, and just to kind of highlight really sort of the commitment that it takes for maybe a member of the public or a other parent or a relative to make contact and actually speak to a social worker to raise concerns, because I think we've had a bit of a default position where sometimes we've felt, well, that sounds malicious, but if you look at the learning from Starr and Arthur, there's mention there about responding to anonymous information and referrals being deemed as malicious, and within our kind of rules that we've created at First Response, we don't deem anonymous referrals malicious by default. If we feel that a child needs to be seen to make a threshold decision, we will go out now and do an intervention visit to look at to cast eyes on that child, to see that child and to make that threshold decision. And if we do feel that the case can close, then we won't close that without agency checks being made. And I guess also to think about when we are making inquiries, I mean, in First Response, when we are making inquiries, it's all done on the telephone, bar the times that we do go out and do an intervention visit. So it is about, you know, the language that's used by the social worker to gather that information, and they have to establish a relationship with parents very, very quickly. So when a social worker's feeling that threshold may be met, you know, we then move on to consent for an assessment, and sometimes that can be a bit of a I think a bit of a tricky area, because we know that if we ask parents outright, sometimes, do you consent to an assessment? 9 times out of 10 parents are probably going to say no. So it is about being creative and being persuasive. And as Georgina, I think Georgina gave some really good tips that the police use, and it's something that, you know, and I'm sure as social workers we also use them, but talking about, you know, the reason that we want to, a social worker wants to come out and speak to you is the fact that we want to do that face to face, that we want to make sure that the child is safe, and just using your persuasive skills and being tenacious in order to be able to go out and see that child and get a better understanding of what's going on. And as in JB's case, you know, being aware of when you're maybe being led up the garden path that the parent is avoiding and using excuses to keep you at arm's length, which is what happened in this case. And like I said, I think if we had this case now, we would respond very differently right at the front door. We would probably, no doubt, go out and do an intervention visit and probably try and break down some of those barriers. So I think I've probably covered the pertinent things, and just to summarise, it is about understanding history, that professional curiosity, challenging the narrative and having those different hypotheses, being in a position where you want to be proved right or proved wrong, to really you know, get to understand what life is like for that child. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insight, Jo, and to Charlotte, who was on before. Just really helpful to look back and see, you know, why we've made some of the changes we've made, and looking at, you know, why we continue to kind of keep developing practice so that, you know, things like this don't happen again. I think it's really really important to also remember, you know, Jo very briefly touched on the fact that, you know, there's similarities here between the serious case review with Arthur. You know, at the time, Arthur had come out in the national media and all the information that had been received, and, you know, this case was very much being worked by First Response at the time, and, you know, a lot of the information we read rang very true to what we were seeing with JB. So I just think a really kind of helpful kind of comparison to some of the learning from his as well. Just over I'm still planning to finish about past, but just to kind of do an overview, and then we're going to hear from Kuda to hear about how JB is doing now. some of this Joe and everybody's talked about, I'm just going to kind of reiterate it. That idea of understanding children's background and past is so important. That idea that we'd really identified that some of JB's behaviours of maybe soiling himself or wetting the bed were linked to trauma in his history, but what we didn't have is that full picture of that history. And you know, I suppose it's that going back and digging for that detail, that professional curiosity that Joe was describing. As Georgina was talking about, capturing that child's voice and lived experience, you know, we saw that child and we you know, saw him in the back of the car, but we didn't fully capture those wishes and feelings. We didn't capture what day-to-day life was like for him. So it's that kind of, you know, being mindful of really seeing children alone and having those conversations. Recognizing neglect and responding to anonymous information. Joe's already kind of talked about that idea that, you know, anonymous information isn't just always malicious information. It takes a lot for a parent or a family member to kind of refer through concerns. So, you know, taking that as that information seriously. Working with avoidant parents, we've heard a couple of strategies of how we could have changed conversations that we had, you know, as well as kind of those doorstop visits, those attempts to go and see those, you know, other ways that we could have tried to engage Dad in those conversations. And then if we weren't getting anywhere, how do we escalate that? And that kind of links nicely to, you know, that confidence in exercising our roles and responsibilities as social work. You know, we had a responsibility to see JB alone, have those conversations, and get that neglect medical at the end to kind of, as Georgina describes it, is, you know, to get to our objectives that we'd set for ourselves. And making sure that we've got the right people involved, and then quite importantly, I suppose, hypothesizing and thinking differently. So changing that narrative of what Dad was saying about his Crohn's and that he believed JB had Crohn's, you know, how do we challenge that narrative? How do we ensure that, you know, this is not neglect or this is neglect, and being able to assess that differently. What I'm going to do, the last video I am going to pull up is the video from CUDA. I'm also going to put in the chat a feedback form. Joe and I would really appreciate some feedback on the session. One of the outcomes for Social Work England registration is about getting feedback from peers. So Joe and I would really appreciate if you could fill out the feedback at the end of the session as well. And also Joe and I will be on after the session if anybody has any further questions or anything else that they wanted to ask. Okay, so I'm just going to start the video from CUDA. You're the allocated social worker for him right now. I would just like to come to you really just to think about what progress has he made really since you've been the allocated social worker to?
Okay, thank you. My name is Kuda Bosha. I'm the allocated social worker for JB. Since my involvement, we managed to get an interim care order for him, and he went to live with foster carers in Rugby, where he is thriving. He's putting weight and presents as a different child. Whilst he's been with his amazing foster carers, JB has felt comfortable to make some disclosures about neglect, physical harm, emotional abuse, whilst in the care of his father and partner. JB is now attending a school where he is living with his foster carers and is doing well. The foster carers has got 2 other foster children, which JB sees them as his siblings. He tells me that those are my brother and my sister. That is my brother and sister, and he's taking on as a big brother role. When he attends school, JB is smartly dressed. He has got PE, and he's also building friendships there in school. Foster carers, they sought some advice from their psychologist in terms of how they can approach or how to best support JB. and advice that they were given from the psychologist was shared with all the professionals that support JB. JB, we went to the final hearing that was in June, and the outcome was the local authority were granted the 4K order for JB, and it's going to remain in foster care. We have attended the matching meeting, and it was agreed that where JB is staying is the right placement for him, because he's thriving there, he's happy, and he's also able to voice his wishes that that's where he wants to remain. He still sees his granddad every month. This is an overnight stay, and this is going well. He also sees via video contact his mom every month, and this is also going well. So we've got a permanent panel meeting booked on this is to discuss Jay final placement, and we hope he remains where he is, where he's doing well.
Lovely. It sounds like he's had a remarkable turnaround, and he's doing remarkably well in foster care.
He is doing well. He is doing well. He presents as a happy child, laughing, and I think it's because he feels secure now where he is.
Lovely. Just to say, well done for a great bit of work, Kuda, in kind of getting that all agreed and getting him to a place where he's obviously quite clearly thriving where he is. And just to say thank you really for kind of speaking to us and updating us about JB today. So thank you so much, Kuda. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me as well.
You're the allocated social worker for him. I don't want to watch it again. Just to kind of say, it was really nice. After I spoke to Kuda, he also sent me a words and pictures he'd done with JB to really explain to JB his life story, where he's got to, how he's got to that point, what contact he's having, and what those conversations are had. So, you know, we kind of leave at this point in kind of being fairly positive that, you know, JB has a good understanding, he's happy in foster care, and he's fully thriving and doing really well. So I'd just like to kind of take an opportunity to thank everybody that have been involved in the session today, and just to remind people really to complete the feedback form, which is in the chat, and then Joe and I will be on the call afterwards if anybody has any further questions. But just to say thank you very much for everybody for listening.